Hello, and welcome to our talk about how Nodo helps to deliver fonts for Unicode scripts. I'm Craig Cornelius, a senior software engineer at Google in the international engineering team. My colleague Marek Jeziorek is a technical program manager specializing in fonts in the Google Fonts team. Indigenous languages around the world are in danger. There are almost 7,000 world languages, but the vast majority are spoken by a very small number of people, according to the United Nations. And half of these, and maybe even up to 95% of them, are in serious danger, maybe extinct by the end of the century. And many of these are languages of indigenous peoples. Small languages disappear for many reasons. Some of them include the fact that the respect for the indigenous language declines because it is not useful. Young people often switch to a dominant language for most communication and therefore don't learn well how to use their language and abandon it. And producing native language content online is often difficult, which again leads people to give up using their native language and switch to dominant languages. Mobile device technology can be useful, but it can also hurt these languages. At a minimum, 3 things are necessary to use a language with current online tools. A standardized script is important, and Unicode is the de facto way of doing this with almost all devices. Of course, a font is needed to show the characters and all the character combinations needed for a language, and input methods such as keyboards are needed to create messages, email, documents, and so on. There is good news. The Unicode standard now supports over 150 scripts and is adding more every release. The Unicode process is available to any language community, typically in consultation and cooperation with a technical expert to bring proposals for standardization. New fonts, then, for living languages are often created by vendors after the Unicode standardization, and keyboard input methods can be built by individuals and vendors, again, after standardization. It's important to note, though, that the last 2 points are not required. No one says that a vendor has to develop a font for a new language or input methods need to be developed. There is some less good news. Of course, we've all seen a situation where when there's no font, we just see empty boxes. Those are typically called tofu. They mean basically that the characters can't be rendered because there's no way to develop or to show the shape. In Unicode font development, even when there is a font, it often lags behind the standard, sometimes by months or even years. Because it is difficult or impossible for many users to install new fonts on their devices, this means that when the fonts are available, they may not appear for the people who need them. And there is no guarantee that new scripts will become available for mobile devices. When there's no mobile keyboard, of course, when there's no font, then of course a mobile keyboard can't be developed. And some of the less good news is, there's also less good news. When there is no font, then a script can't be used. We're all familiar with the empty boxes that appear when the font is unavailable, typically called tofu. And Nodo Font there's also less good news. When a font is missing, a script can't be used. We're all familiar with tofu, as shown by empty boxes. Unicode font development often lags behind the standardization process. Even when a script is encoded, there may not be a font available for months or even years. And because it is difficult or impossible to install new fonts on a device, sometimes these fonts, even when available, can't be used by a typical user. And for mobile devices, typically, there is no guarantee that these new scripts will be available. And when there's no font, of course, a mobile keyboard doesn't work. And also, many living scripts are still not encoded in the Unicode standard. It's really important to note that the wait for a font on mobile is one of the biggest issues, and it can hasten the decline of a language.
Noto Fonts were started at Google around 2012. Initially, they were known as the Droid font family because of their connection with the Android phone system. However, at this point, they are distributed widely in many Google products and not only there. The Unicode standard is what informs Noto activities. Noto is solely focused on the set of languages and characters included in the International Unicode standard. In other words, if a script is in Unicode, then it has a chance to be part of Noto. However, if a script is not in Unicode, it will never be considered for Noto. Unicode expands every year. The Noto project now offers fonts for 149 scripts out of Unicode's 154 scripts, 77,661 characters, covering 54% of Unicode's 143,859 code points, and supporting over 1,000 languages. This is opening the door to reading and writing online for many different minority language speakers. Noto, internally for the purpose of development priorities and scope, classifies scripts as living, revival, which is a special subcategory of living scripts, and historical. For all the living scripts, including those being revived, we've been striving to have at the minimum fonts with a range of weights from regular to bold. This range of styles is important for providing emphasis in a user interface. However, for the most frequently used scripts, we aim to provide a greater range of weights and widths, to provide for designing documents, and even support regional variants such as for Arabic and Hebrew. Noto is open source. Both the script sources and the font binaries are available on GitHub. Anybody can download Noto and use the fonts. Some people contribute to source changes, but many more people contribute by documenting what they consider to be issues with the fonts. On this slide, you can see two recent graphs pertaining to the issues. The graph on the left presents the weekly issue creation and closure for the last 17 weeks, ending with Sunday, 25th of April. The right graph shows the number of issues per script. From the right graph, you can see that we know the most about our Latin, Greek, Cyrillic fonts, then Arabic, then Myanmar. Note that the number of issues indicates how much we know about a given script and doesn't correlate to the quality of a font. In particular, I'm especially proud of our all Noto Arabic scripts. I believe our Arabic scripts on GitHub are of world-class quality. I mentioned that Unicode has the biggest impact on what we do for Noto. In addition to Unicode, when we plan at the beginning of each year our work for Noto, we also look at the GitHub issues reported by the users and discuss if we want to expand or enhance Noto styles. This allows us to come up with a proposed budget. We present this as a funding proposal, which is reviewed and finalized. We usually adjust our priorities to match the funding, and then we start the work. This is our general development scheme. Now, back to my colleague, Craig, for a more in-depth look.
There are serious font challenges for indigenous languages. First of all, even if languages use the same script, there are language-specific shapes that need to be considered. On the right, for example, we can see the Burmese form of a character versus the Shan preferred way of showing this character. There are sometimes unanticipated diacritics and ligatures or joining that are not expected as well. One example is Yoruba, which has diacritic marks on characters that are not generally expected by most Latin fonts. And in this case, the accents may appear incorrectly positioned or may not appear at all. There's also a technical stack compatibility that is critical for correct font display. Rendering engines and applications also impact the final display, and there are different rendering engines and different installations among devices. So the revision of the whole system is critical to getting the right displays. Sometimes screen versus print or server versus client side makes a difference. In the yellow, we see an example of a recently fixed Google problem with the rendering of Burmese character shapes. On the left is the way things should be shown. On the right is the way that these characters were represented in some PDFs. This was fixed, but it was a server versus client and version of rendering engine problem. And application-specific font technologies may be required for particular uses. Not all text displays, not all word processing devices, not all applications work with all the same fonts. One other example that's interesting and has recently become important is the ATypI. ATypI uses the Myanmar script, but they require that the characters have this large dot, which appears on this character at the lower left of the character. But the Burmese rendering does not have that. So the variation selector technology needs to be supported by the rendering engine and the application. Mobile devices offer an especially big challenge. Often there's just one font that's available on a device for various reasons, including lack of space, and the language is often ignored. One example is Android, which ships the Naskh style of Arabic font everywhere. However, Urdu speakers prefer the Nastaliq, which is shown on the right. Font support may be limited. Usually fonts are only added in new releases, or sometimes only on new devices. And of course, a keyboard is not possible before the font is available, and there is no support for non-Unicode fonts. And such use often continues well after the Unicode standardization process is completed. So, one example of a real success is the Cherokee Script. It's a key to the identity of the Cherokee people, and the syllabary was developed in the late 1820s by a man named Sequoyah. It quickly led to adoption by the Cherokee Nation and growth in literacy of the Cherokee people. And quickly after that, a printing press and typesets were developed with metal type, which led to newspapers, books, and educational materials, and all kinds of printed documents being created by the Cherokee Nation. Typewriters were invented in the 20th century, including standard typewriters and a special electric type ball. Very expensive options, but they were useful for people wanting to produce Cherokee printing. And then in 1999, Cherokee was added to the Unicode standard. This has led to a growth in the ability of people to create and use the Cherokee language on their machines. It also supports the immersion schools, which operate in the Cherokee Nation, teaching kids as young as 3 years old how to use the Cherokee language and read and write in it. The Cherokee Nation has also developed Unicode fonts, quite a wide variety of them actually, including the standard one, which is very much like the the metal type one shown above, and the lower one called the Wilma Man Killer font, which is very similar to the handwritten script used for Cherokee. Because Unicode supports Cherokee, all online tools can use it as well, including search and in Gmail, and Gboard supports keyboards for Cherokee as well. And more recently, the Cherokee Nation has adopted the Noto Sans Cherokee as its official font. There's a virtuous cycle of scripts and fonts and input methods. When Indigenous experts first build a non-Unicode font encoding, and then propose that to Unicode, this can lead to Unicode adoption. Then professional font development can create fonts that can be used by these communities in the Unicode form, and desktop fonts then let people develop custom keyboards, for example, using the Keyman application. This, of course, leads to usage and critical evaluation, and that feedback often leads to adjustments for community preferences or development of new fonts. And when a mobile font is available, then vendors can build input methods for that. And again, people give feedback and use it more widely. The result is that there are more ways to communicate and educate in that native language, and the language has increased visibility and respect from both the community and outsiders. There are other success stories in fonts and keyboards and users. For example, ADLAM for the Fulfulde language was standardized in 2018 and became available in mobile devices very quickly. So the Unicode and Noto font and Gboard are being widely used across Africa Hanafi Rohingya is a more recently added script. It's important, especially because the Rohingya people are widely dispersed now, and their script is now available on modern mobile devices. The Osage tribe in Oklahoma is also using fonts and input methods for its language renewal. The Chakma people, 500,000 of them in Bangladesh and India, use the font and are currently using mobile devices. The Taipake group, a fairly small community, now uses more advanced technology of variation selectors to produce characters the way they like to see them with the dots. And most recently, the Tangsa Lakum script is being added to Unicode 14, and innovators have already adopted the font to Unicode. In conclusion, rising computer and mobile technology increases communications, especially for Indigenous peoples. And these Indigenous languages work and thrive when technology is implemented and distributed. When there's collaboration and cooperation between technology experts and community language leaders, world languages can be preserved and can move into the modern world of technology. So fonts and keyboards can help Indigenous groups survive and thrive in the modern world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Well, that was fascinating, and I learned one or two things, despite having been a fan of Nodo for a long time. We have just one or two questions so far. Aaron McLaughlin was asking, how and where are the language-specific character preferences being documented, like those on your slide with the Burmese versus Shan? Does this info exist only within the Nodo font source, or is it documented somewhere else?
Marek, do you have
I actually don't know the answer. Basically, I actually do not exactly know how Noto at this point deals with the differences. So I cannot promise that it's within the source, but I believe we have some issues. As I mentioned earlier, we are open. We invite people to submit any number of issues that they find. I believe we have some issues related to it. Whether but where is this documented? I actually don't know. So.
Right.
And I would concur. I don't know if there is any central place where any such documentation exists. Very often, I've heard this anecdotally from people who somehow connected with us at Google, saying, "Oh, but it's great that you support our font, but we don't like the way it looks. Our community doesn't like the shapes." And
Yeah.
sometimes we don't really have a way of learning that unless there's some online posting that comes to our attention. In the case of the Shan shape, I actually noted this when I was in contact with some people, and they said, well, look at the notes on the Noto issues in GitHub. And right there was documentation with pictures showing the shapes of the characters and the way they wanted them. There are features of font handling that let certain characters be selected for when the language is set. But that has to be set, for example, in a web page, and then it has to trickle down into the font management itself. But most users don't have a way of doing that, or people who develop their own websites don't know how to or don't bother to set the language of their websites. So that information isn't selectable.
Yeah, it only works if the web page or whatever has not only specified an encoding, but a specific language. Right.
And,
so as to activate that LOCL feature in the OpenType font.
And the font has to have it, and the rendering system all has to work together. I've built some websites where I say, oh, use this font, but getting it all to work right is tricky. The thing I mentioned with the Pake is interesting because there is a facility in Unicode. It's defined for certain characters in Unicode standard that there are variations allowed. They don't say exactly what the shape has to be, but they give hints. And a font can indeed use this extra code point that's actually put after the character to say, select an alternate. So it's an explicit way to tell the font to pick an alternate. If the font has that capability and the rendering system is smart enough to do that, it works well. In the case of ATypI, I've delivered a keyboard via Keyman, and people are starting to use this. On some phones, it works well to show the dotted forms. On some phones, the dots are completely missing, but the characters look all right. On other phones, the characters appear, and then there's a tofu-like shape that is rendered where the variation selector, this extra character, is actually supposed to be used to change the shape of the previous character. So all the pieces have to work together. And those are just two mechanisms that I'm aware of. Handling this, especially in phones where there's usually only one font or two fonts available for a character, is awfully tricky.
Yeah. So another question we have from Tom Grace is a much broader one. In your experience, what has been the biggest challenge in developing Noto for minority languages?
For one, I wanted to make sure that you are all aware, I believe you are all aware, that Google by itself doesn't develop any fonts. We commission fonts with outside developers. And so we sort of push the challenge onto the font developers. But I'll give you an example of Yazidi. Yazidi was one of the fonts that we have recently developed. And the challenge was to find community large enough so we get meaningful feedback on the development. And the font developer found this community in Georgia, not state of Georgia, but Georgia in Caucasus. And thanks to this, I think we have succeeded. However, I still would love to get feedback. I haven't seen any bugs, but I haven't seen bugs on GitHub because probably people didn't have a chance to use it. So the challenge is basically validating with the community. That's, to me, that's the biggest challenge.
Fair enough. Another question we have, Mamun Sakal, the Arabic type designer, says, I'm considering designing a font for an African language that uses the Arabic script and is already in Unicode. I'm not clear about the process of developing a keyboard layout for the language. Is there a common process to follow? And I think you, Craig, made mention of Keyman earlier. You might want to expand on that, for instance.
The interesting thing about keyboards is that there are no necessary standards for the positioning of characters. The most important thing with a keyboard or an input method is somehow people need to be able to type all the characters that are used in that. I'm not a keyboard design expert, but I work on a subcommittee of the Common Locale Data Repository group for keyboards, and we are busy trying to collect keyboard layouts, also writing a standard where there is a definition of basic layout information and some performance or behavior of keyboards when people do things like long press and so on. So the mechanisms for defining and implementing keyboards are available. There are commercial tools that one can buy to build them. There's the Microsoft Keyboard MKCL keyboard code develop. There's the MKLC is a tool that you can use to build your own Microsoft Windows keyboards, but only for scripts that are in the base of the Unicode standard, not supplemental characters.
Right. I think that's the Microsoft Keyboard Layout Creator.
Yes, I had the letters in the wrong order. That's an old tool, but it seems to work. There are things like Ukulele on Macintosh, and there are lots of other tools for Linux and other devices. People have built things for mobile device building keyboards. As to how to build the keyboard that best serves the language, I would not invent a new layout. If there's already an existing way of typing Arabic, I would use that. The font should work just fine with that. If you want to make the keyboard have the font on the keycaps, then that will help people use it more effectively. If there's a good reason to change the layout, that's of course possible too. But even my younger son, for a long time, didn't type with the keyboard I use. He went to Dvorak, and I would always get confused, and he would get confused when we switched computers because the layouts are in different places. The wonderful thing about keyboards is there's so many standards. The terrible thing about keyboards is that there's so many ways of doing it. So I don't have specific advice there other than don't build something new unless you really want to confuse people, or unless there's some distinct advantage in the new layout and that you expect people to learn how to use your tool in addition to the tools they're already using.
So it sounds like if this other writing system basically uses Arabic, possibly with minor changes, that starting with an Arabic keyboard layout and modifying it if needed would be the route to go. Is that fair?
That's what I'd recommend. If the person is developing a new font for Arabic, it's like using Times Roman versus Nodo Sans versus Comic Sans. The keys are the keys, the codes are the codes. The way it looks is up to the font.
Cool. So Neil Patel asks us, is there a plan to have Nodo Fonts available like the rest of the Google Fonts library, so that is integrated into the Google Fonts system? It would be a good way for the average user to not only reach the fonts for, okay, this is a little wording glitch here, for possible also set selectors for variants.
So the answer is yes. We have currently we have very old Get Noto website. This will be replaced fairly soon. And Noto Fonts fairly soon, probably later after Get Noto replacement, all Noto fonts will be available on fonts.google.com in the same way that every other font there is available.
Right. So what's happening is both the existing Get Noto site is being replaced with something better, and the fonts are going to be available in Google Fonts.
Initially, it will
Right.
be probably very close to fonts.google.com, Get Noto replacement. And then later, all of the Noto fonts will appear on fonts.google.com in the same way everything else is there.
Sweet. So Sophia Tai asks, how do type designers get involved with newly encoded script projects? Are they chosen and invited by the team? Do they have to be designed with a proposal to hand in? Is there a community or forum where we can find out about these opportunities?
Basically, how would I say it? I am, and I don't want to bias you because there are so many fantastic font designers. There are more fantastic font designers than opportunities on Noto. So, however, I went to University of Reading, didn't go attend the program, but in the summer they have a 2-week program. I went there twice. I loved University of Reading. So I've been sort of, if you went to University of Reading, let me propose something for you. But this is not the case. Everybody has opportunity. I don't want to give out my email here, but let me go to, my recommendation right now would be, there is a way to create on Noto-Fonts, create an issue. If you are interested in making some font for us, propose it there. Create an issue for this. You don't have Noto font for serif Odia. I'm a perfect person. Here is my work or whatever. This is, for now, I think this would be the best way to do it. So there is no secret club. But I mean, how would I say it? If we worked with somebody and we love their work, we usually go, if we don't have anybody else to work on something, we will try to reach out to them. Are you available? So.
I'd also like to point out that once a font has been made by one group, by one company, there's often a much bigger incentive for other companies to jump in and build other fonts. For example, once Nodo released an Adlam font, then Microsoft approached the brothers Berry, who invented that writing system. And for a while, the brothers could not talk to me, even though I was a collaborator with them on things for Google, because they were in touch with Microsoft, and Microsoft has come out with a beautiful font. Some of the people on this call can talk more about that has been very successful in Microsoft world. So some healthy competition occurs when one company or one group develops a font and other people say, hey, we need to have that on our systems. It's part of the virtuous cycle.
Cool. Let's see. I'm just going to copy the link into the main chat window. Craig, you posted it in the Q&A section, but only the person who posted it can see it there. So that's the link to the Nodo Fonts GitHub repo. So for people to follow up on Marek's advice if they are interested in, contributing to a particular future font, they can file an issue there.
I'd also point out at the top of that page, there is a place that says issues, and right now there are 803 issues, but they are reviewed. That's a place to give feedback. That's a place to actually comment on the existing fonts. And although I'm not on the fonts team, and I'm by no means an artist or a font designer, I've been very pleased to see that the fonts group is really responsive and has done major revisions of some fonts based upon user feedback. So it's always a question about how important is it and what impact does an issue have. But there is a mechanism here that isn't available for many commercial fonts. So the open source availability is a key part of what we're talking about here today.
Cool. So it looks like we may be almost out of questions. Anybody?
I do want to emphasize that if people are in touch with communities that feel that their writing systems aren't available, there are multiple ways of getting in touch with the Unicode standards people. There is a script encoding initiative run out of the University of California at Berkeley, and I'd be happy to connect people. There is also a tension in that with existing scripts that are in Unicode standard and groups that sometimes say, well, I don't like the shapes of those characters because that other group of my language community uses those shapes, but our group uses these shapes, and we want to disunify. We want to make a complete set of new characters with different shapes. It's important to understand that the Unicode standard does not determine the exact shapes of the characters, but so to disunify means that many existing documents won't work if people have invented a new set of codes for a variant of the language. On the other hand, when fonts are not available, or when multiple fonts can't be chosen on a device, but people have very strong preferences in their communities, then disunification is often tempting because they would like to have their own font on their own phones that has it their way for their community. There's a lot of tension here between the shape and the underlying abstract definition of what characters are. And that tension isn't going to go away, but working with the Unicode process will help people balance that, because there are people on these committees who, again, are very responsive and give lots of feedback and advice to people who want to worry about the whole thing, from the whole process from standardization all the way through to developing new keyboard methods. All the pieces can fit together, but it doesn't happen overnight. But it happens when people actually are involved in it and give feedback.
So we have
one more. I saw one more question about.
Oh, please.
Yeah.
I heard that the script-specific repos were the direction Noto was going, such as, and here is a URL, as opposed to a large repo just posted. So currently, Noto has separate repository for sources and a separate repository for fonts. The URL that Craig posted is our font repository. This is not a source repository. Sooner or later, and no earlier than 2-3 months from now, we would love to have a single repository per script. So for example, currently we have 9 sources for Latin, Greek, Cyrillic. We might have single repository for all of the Latin sources, Latin, Greek, Cyrillic sources, and Latin, Greek, Cyrillic binaries. I would love to have also documentation. There was a question about the differences between Shan and Burmese. I would love to have a sort of place to put this kind of documentation. So in the long run, yes, we will have something that is common per script, per writing system. But for now, I'm pointing everybody to Noto Fonts because this is what exists right now. I don't know when we will have the new version of font running for all of the scripts.
Right. Plus, if someone's talking about a writing system that doesn't yet have a Nodo font, where in the new world, where would that go? Will there still be a Nodo fonts repo?
That's a good question. I would love to have a single repository for issues, because, and this is not decided yet, because there are issues that sort of span multiple scripts. So the answer is, I actually don't know the answer. Yeah.
Fair enough. Oh, well, this is perhaps more of a Unicode question than a Nodo question, but Cesar Portas asks, any views on artificial writing systems? When should or shouldn't they be designed?
What do you mean artificial writing systems?
Yeah, I'm kind of curious about that too. Would Adlam count? You know, it was invented. Of course, that's also true of Korean, right? Modern Korean was you know, at one time was an artificially created writing system.
As far as new artificial writing scripts writing scripts, anything if it's part of Unicode, it has a chance to be in Noto. And if it's not part of Unicode, it will never be included in Noto.
So really the answer is convince Unicode. Is that a fair
yes.
summation?
And I just have a note on that. Convincing Unicode is not a matter of saying, or the Unicode standard doesn't say, well, this is a bad script or this is a good script. The Unicode standard committees look at proposals and say, can you give evidence that this is something that people are really using or that has historical precedent? Are there documents out there? Is the script being used in schools? Are children learning how to use it? Is there signage? Is it used on products? Do people have published newspapers, newsletters? Any kind of use of this is a strong evidence that the Unicode committee will respect and ask for if it's missing. The Unicode people don't want to encourage every high school student who thinks that she or he has a great new way of writing a language to submit that to the Unicode standard. But if there is something that has been adopted by a community and is actually showing real benefit to that community, then that can be a strong candidate. It's also important to realize that the whole process can take several years. It doesn't happen overnight, and people need to be patient with this. But when they're patient and when the process works, then the time between standardization and actually starting to show up in mobile devices or being able to be used on a desktop computer can be fairly short.
Right. Now, I think Unicode has historically made some distinction between invented writing systems for real-world languages versus invented writing systems for what you might broadly call fictional languages. So, for instance, Tolkien's Elvish writing systems, or other, or Klingon from Star Trek. those writing systems tend not to get encoded in Unicode, right? So artificial writing systems still have to be writing systems for real world languages, or Unicode seems to ignore them. Is that a fair summation?
I think so. And what is real world? There are Klingon speakers around the world, and they can happily write Klingon in the Latin script. One reason that they can't write it in the script that's seen in the movies and television shows is that there are copyrights on that, and Unicode is not going to violate copyright standards, and so there are other limitations. If people are using Elvish and they can show that the various Elvish scripts are actively used in real life, then it may be worth pursuing that. But we're not going to do, or the Unicode standard isn't going to standardize things that are from projects that are a person's high school or college class project to make something interesting and fun. One could also argue that emojis are kind of in that category as well. There are people in the Unicode standard who say, "Oh, it's been great that we've done emojis," and there are other people who use the facepalm emoji frequently, saying, "Why did we do this?" And again, there are good arguments to be made for each and every character, and committees decide these things based on their merits and usefulness. And I think at the University of Reading, is that typed with R-E-D-D-I-N-G?
R-E-A-D-I-N-G.
Oh, it is R-E-A. Aha.
Yeah, spelled like reading. It's just pronounced Reading.
Aha. So I made a mistake. Yeah. First mistake ever.
Well, we've all got to make a mistake sometime. Any other questions? Well, thank you, gentlemen. That was fascinating and helpful and engendered a lot of discussion.
I really appreciate the good questions.
We'll hope to continue more open chat with everyone being able to actually talk in the chat room shortly.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.